Think about it for a moment. You go to a bank, you deposit money, and the bank tells you, if you keep your money here, I'll give you a little more money, or the exact opposite. You go to a bank, you take out a loan, and the bank tells you, I'm giving you this money, but you'll have to pay back a little extra. That little extra is interest. Sounds simple, right? But this simple concept changed the course of history. It triggered wars, it brought down empires, and today it still directly shapes the lives of billions of people. Today we are going to talk about interest from every perspective. We'll start with what it actually is. We'll travel back in time to look at its history. We'll look at the central bank's interest rates. We'll look at the interest the banks give to us. And finally, we will ask this question, is interest a good thing or is it bad? If you're ready, let's begin. In its simplest definition, interest means this: the rent on money. You stay in a house, you pay rent. You use someone else's money, you pay interest. It's the exact same logic. When you deposit money into a bank, you are actually lending money to the bank. The bank takes that money and lends it to others as loans, and it pays you a fee. We call this deposit interest. The reverse is also true. When you take out a loan, the bank lends you money, and you pay it a fee. We call this loan interest. Now here is a critical point. Interest is not just a number. Interest is actually a signal. High interest says, money is expensive right now. Borrowing is hard. Save your money. Low interest says, money is cheap. Spend it, invest, grow. And these signals affect the entire economy. The investment decisions of corporations, your decision on whether to buy a house or not, the borrowing costs of governments. In other words, interest is like the pulse of the economy. Now let me tell you something. Interest is as old as money itself. In fact, some historians argue that interest actually invented money. About 5,000 years ago. In Mesopotamia, across the lands of modern-day Iraq and modern Kurdistan, the Sumerians were carving things into clay tablets using cuneiform script. Let's zoom in a little. What were they carving? Debt contracts. I gave you 10 pieces of silver. You will return 12 pieces of silver at harvest time. This is one of the earliest known records of interest in human history. Then came Hammurabi, the year 1750 BC. The Code of Hammurabi, known as the first written laws in history, also regulated interest rates, 20% for silver loans, 33% for grain loans. This means that even 3,700 years ago, governments were trying to control interest. Sounds fascinating, but why? Because when interest is left unchecked, it can become dangerous. In ancient Greece, loan sharks turned poor farmers into slaves. In Rome, debt crises repeatedly triggered massive riots and rebellions. In medieval Europe, even the church banning interest shook the economic system to its core. Throughout history, interest has always been controversial. It was forbidden in religious texts. It was questioned by philosophers, but it never disappeared. Because lending money has always required a price. But to truly understand how interest became the monster it is today, we have to look at a turning point in modern history. For a long time, money was tied to something real, gold. Under the gold standard, central banks couldn't just print money out of thin air. Every dollar in circulation had to be backed by a specific amount of gold sitting in a vault. This naturally limited how much debt could be created, and it kept interest rates relatively stable. Then came 1971. President Richard Nixon unlinked the US dollar from gold. In a single moment, money became fiat money, it became political, it became a piece of paper backed by nothing but the government's promise, and when you can print infinite money, you can create infinite debt. Suddenly, interest rates weren't just pricing the risk of a local borrower anymore. They became the ultimate steering wheel for global wealth. Now let's come to the modern world. You turn on the news. They say, the Fed raised interest rates by 50 basis points. Or they cut interest rates. And everyone is talking about it. Markets start shaking. The dollar spikes or drops. So what exactly is this interest rate? The interest rate announced by the central bank, the Fed, is actually this: the interest rate that banks pay when they borrow money from each other or from the Fed. So this interest rate doesn't affect you directly, it affects the banks. You might say, why should I care? But because it affects the banks, it indirectly affects you too. Think about it this way. The Fed raises interest rates, banks now borrow money from each other at a higher cost. This cost is passed down to you. Your mortgage rate goes up. Your personal loan rate goes up. Companies can no longer borrow money to invest. The economy slows down. So why would the Fed do this? It sounds counterintuitive, but there is a reason for it: to control inflation. In its simplest terms, if there is too much money circulating in the economy, prices skyrocket. The Fed raises interest rates, money becomes expensive, spending decreases. Inflation slows down. We saw the ultimate test of this in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Inflation in the U.S. was raging at over 14%. The economy was on the brink of chaos. Then Fed Chairman Paul Volcker did something insane. He raised interest rates to an unprecedented, jaw-dropping 20%. It was economic chemotherapy. It triggered a massive recession. Businesses went bankrupt and unemployment spiked. But it worked. It broke the back of inflation. It proved that central banks are willing to crash the economy just to keep control of the currency. The exact opposite is also true. If the economy is stagnating, the Fed cuts interest rates, money becomes cheap. People borrow more, they spend, they invest. Spoiler alert, crypto and stock market videos are coming up next, so make sure to subscribe and stay tuned. The economy comes back to life. So the Fed's interest rate actually works like a massive economic gas pedal and brake. You press it, the speed increases. You lift your foot, it slows down. So how do banks give you interest? The system is actually quite simple. You deposit $100 into the bank takes it and lends it to someone else for $110. It pays you $4 in interest, and it keeps the remaining $6 as profit. This difference is called the spread. In short, banks live on interest. They buy low on interest, and they sell high. Now let's face reality. There is a major problem, especially when inflation comes into play, just like we discussed in our previous videos. Let's say the bank gives you a 4% interest rate, but inflation is sitting at 7%. In that case, you aren't actually making money. On the contrary, you are losing it. This is called the real interest rate. Real interest rate equals nominal interest rate minus inflation. If this result is negative, keeping your money in the bank is actually making you poorer. That's why economists always say, don't look at the nominal interest rate, look at the real interest rate. Let's see what that really implies. And now we come to the most controversial question of all. Is interest a good thing or is it bad? The answer is, it's both. Let me explain. The good things interest does, it encourages savings. It drives people to save for tomorrow instead of spending everything today. It makes investment possible. An entrepreneur who has a great idea but no capital can borrow money from a bank. They start a business, they hire people. The economy grows, it prices risk. A riskier borrower faces a higher interest rate. This system regulates where the money flows. The bad things interest does, it creates a debt trap. A low-income individual takes out a loan. They can't pay the interest. They borrow more just to cover it. They can never escape that loop. It increases inequality through an economic phenomenon known as the Cantillon effect. When the Fed lowers interest rates and pumps cheap money into the system, that money doesn't distribute evenly. It goes to the big banks and Wall Street firms first. They use that cheap money to buy up real estate, stocks, and assets before the average person even smells it. By the time that money reaches the working class, prices have already gone up. Those who own assets get richer, and those who rely on a paycheck get poorer. And according to certain religious systems, interest is morally wrong. In Islam, interest is strictly forbidden. In medieval Christianity, usury was considered a sin, because there is an underlying belief that money should not breed money. So, who is right? The honest answer is, interest is a tool. Tools are neither inherently good or bad. It all depends on how they are used. A knife can slice bread, but in the wrong hands it becomes dangerous. Interest is no different. We covered a lot today. We started with what interest is. We traveled back to the Sumerian tablets 5,000 years ago. We saw how unlinking money from gold changed the rules of the game. We decoded those mysterious Fed interest rate decisions. We saw what banks actually do behind the scenes. And finally, we debated whether interest is good or bad, but I think the real question isn't, is interest good or bad? The real question is, who controls the interest, who benefits from it, and who pays the price? Because in a modern economy, interest isn't just a number. Interest is an instrument of power, and understanding how this power is wielded is perhaps the most fundamental step to understanding economics itself. Let's close with one final question. Why do the ultra-rich pay almost zero taxes? Let's leave this open for debate. See you in the comments. Stay healthy, stay curious, and stay grounded in reality. See you next time. Goodbye.